Soldier Mage King, Chapter 29. The Nightmare Begins. In hindsight, maybe Merlin hadn't been thinking clearly when she'd helped Spirit Morgana out of Camelot and given her directions to the Druids. It hadn't been her best idea, especially considering what Uther was now planning since he believed Morgana had been kidnapped. She'd been thinking about the little girl she'd been years ago, afraid to go outside in case someone found out the truth. She still remembered her mother telling her she had to be careful every morning from the time she could understand the words. According to Huneth, Merlin's birth had been a difficult one she'd suffered through on her own. Merlin had been born in the middle of winter, just before Yule. Ealdor had been in the grips of a massive snowstorm blown down from the mountains that formed the massive border between Estir and Camelot. Huneth had never told the story to anyone but Merlin herself. This was because when Merlin was born, she had been still, as though dead. Huneth had cried for all that could have been, and as she did, a Merlin had landed in the glassless window, knocking aside the covering that was keeping out the snow. The way her mother had told it, the bird's eyes had been bright gold, and it had cried out. When it did, Merlin's own eyes had opened, the same gold as the bird. The whole house had warmed, and the babe had begun to cry, as a normal child should. Her eyes had not faded to blue for nearly a solid month, and there had been a fire burning in the hearth for just as long. Huneth had named her for the bird, though she still wasn't sure if it had been just a bird. Her mother had claimed she was a sickly child, and had to keep her inside until she was nearly 5, and had some kind of control, tenuous though it was. She had never been close to the other children. Will had been the exception, and that was only because he was too stubborn to listen to the adults around him who had always found something odd about Merlin. She, for her part, had avoided the town proper whenever she could. Fear was her first friend, and still one of her strongest allies, keeping her aware of everything around her at every moment. She hadn't wanted it to be that way for Morgana. It was a very lonely way to live. It carved out pieces and seemed to sew the mouth shut around secrets that could never be shared. The girl was in more danger than Merlin, though her powers had developed much later in life. Uther hung over her like a badly fitted chandelier. Every moment might mean the snapping of the fragile chain holding him back. Merlin knew for a fact that Uther had already acted in violence against Morgana, slamming her against walls and chairs with his hand around her throat and locking her in the dungeon for her opinions. The Druids were peaceful, constantly on the move, and took in those with magical abilities. She hated that she had to drag her back to Camelot, but it was that or a mass execution. In the end, Arthur got Morgana back, but at the cost of the leader of the camp, Aglin. Mordred also escaped, though last time Merlin saw him, he was running in the opposite direction of the rest of the Druids, who had all escaped under the cover of Merlin's magically summoned fog. Morgana was back in Camelot, but she seemed more unhappy than before, and Merlin wasn't all that surprised that she didn't want to speak to her. Morgana frowned out her window, watching as Merlin hurried across the courtyard, oblivious to the fact she was being watched. Morgana couldn't help but wonder a few things about the girl. Arthur had always said that she was afraid of magic, flinching at the very mention of it. But that couldn't be true. Merlin had tried to help her. Uther was the problem, though that was hardly news. Morgana's working theory was that Merlin was afraid of the consequences of magic, not the force itself. After all, Merlin wasn't from Camelot. Morgana looked down at the book in her hands. It was a book of laws from Estir. She'd been curious. In the very back, she'd found Senred's standing laws on magic. Any person who showed powers was to report to the capital. They owed a lifetime of service to the crown, so they could ensure their gifts were used for the right purpose. Druids owed service to the crown as well, according to Senred. Anyone in the bounds of his kingdom who held magical talent must use it for the benefit of his crown. Morgana shuddered. The consequences for those found to be breaking these laws were near as severe as Uther's laws against magic. She remembered Merlin's friend Will, a self-confessed sorcerer, and his hatred for all nobles. It made more sense now. She was starting to dislike most nobles these days. She hadn't been with the Druids long enough to learn anything except Aglin's first lesson. Magic was not a dark force used only for evil. It could be a force for good. Looking back on all the dreams she'd had that she knew had come to pass, Morgana frowned. Though Merlin had never featured in those dreams herself, the real-world results had gone well when Merlin was involved. Morgana had stayed up all night when Arthur left with Sophia and spotted Merlin soaked through, helping Galahad get Arthur inside. Merlin had always believed her when she had a nightmare. Sighing, Morgana tossed the book aside, wincing at the thump it made. She'd been ordered to stay off her feet until her leg fully healed. She'd been lucky it hadn't been more serious, and that only Gaius had recognized it as a sting from a circuit. Evidently, they were deadly, unless magic was involved. Gaius had sworn to keep it a secret. She knew she could trust him, and hoped that maybe she could trust Merlin as well. She wasn't sure, though. She had been among her own kind with the Druids, and she missed it. She understood Merlin's reasoning for coming to get her, but still, she hadn't wanted to leave. Her only comfort was that the guards had yet to find the rest of the camp.